Okay, so in this lecture, I want to just sort of finish up utilitarianism. It's kind of a wrap-up of the theory. At the end, I'll talk about just a quick summary of what I think are the strengths of the theory as well as the weaknesses. Um, before doing that, though, I do want to talk pretty quickly about one final objection to utilitarianism. It's a bit more theoretical, a bit less practical than the ones we've talked about, but I do think it's going to be important. And it's especially going to be important, I think we need to have it on the table now, because in thinking about virtue theory, which we'll talk about much later in the semester, it will be important. Okay, so what's the objection I have in mind? Well, think about what a utilitarian says. Remember how they answered this question, what makes someone's life go well? Happiness, pleasure, and the absence of pain. Well, let me give you guys a situation. Imagine that some mad scientist offered you this chance. He said, well, look, I've discovered a way to run wires directly into the pleasure center of people's brains. What I'll do, I'll drill a hole in your skull, we'll run the wires in, we'll plug it up to current, and you will just feel bliss for the rest of your days. Now, look, of course, you're not going to be doing anything, so we'll put you in a bed, we'll put a feeding tube down you, but, for the next however many years you have left, you are just going to lay in this bed and passively feel perfect pleasure. Now, the question is, would you let him do it? Or maybe an even better one, would you think that he's made you a good offer? Would you think that is a good life to just lay there in this bed feeling pleasure all the time, right? Look, I know there's practical issues. You say, well, how do I know I can trust him? But imagine, he shows you, he's like, look, I've had people here 30 years. Look at this guy. He's been laying in the bed. Now, of course, he looks awful. He's got contractures. He's all shriveled up. But, he doesn't care. Look how happy he is. Look at the smile on his face. The thing is, when posed with this choice, would you think that he's offered you a great life? Would you feel envy for the guy who's laying in there in the bed all shriveled up but feeling perfect happiness? Or if my, wire in the brain case is too science fiction for you, imagine that somebody is a heroin addict, but they just get all the heroin they want all the time, good medical care. Would you think there's anything wrong with this person's life? If you say yes, then I think that's going to create a problem for utilitarianism. So why is that? Well, again, let us think of this question, what makes someone's life go well? The utilitarian says happiness, and happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. Now look, what I'm trying to do in thinking about these cases is to put some pressure on the way that utilitarians answer this first question. Well, if happiness is really what makes someone's life go well, and happiness is really nothing more than pleasure and the absence of pain, then you would have to admit that this person with a wire run into his brain would be having the best possible life anyone could have. He feels 24/7 pleasure, and he feels, let us imagine, no pain. You probably would not think that. And most of you at least, I've had a few students, and I always find this a little depressing, I've had a few who's like, yeah, put the wire. Right now, they have it, I'd have it in my brain. I can't poll you guys, of course, because this is an online class, but I'm going to guess if I polled you, most of you would not just shoot your hands up and say, yeah, I would go for that. Most of you would not think that would be a good life for you. Now look, what a utilitarian might say is, well, look, even if there were real cases like this, how's it going to create the most overall happiness if you're just a sponge on society? So we wouldn't say hook yourself up, right? But again, the reason they would give you for not hooking yourself up, that you wouldn't be creating the most overall happiness, doesn't seem to be the reason you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it, I imagine, because you would think it would be bad for you. And given the way the utilitarian defines what makes people's life go well, they couldn't say that. They would have to say that if you were hooked up to this machine, your own life would be going as well as possible. So how might one respond to these worries? Well, there's a modern utilitarian, this guy J.J.C. Smart. He basically just says, again, garbage in, garbage out, right? Who cares if my theory gives weird answers to sci-fi cases? I'll come back to this point because I think it's more important than that. But Mill is worried about objections like this. And this is why he brings up this distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Mill will say, well, pleasure and the absence of pain are all that matters, but not all pleasures are created equal. Some pleasures are higher, and if they're higher, they're better than lower pleasures. And higher pleasures are those that involve distinctly human abilities. Sex, food, drink, those are all lower pleasures. Animals presumably can do most of that stuff. Drugs, the same way, right? We can give an animal drugs. Scientists have given animals drugs. They react pretty much the same way we do to heroin and stuff like that, right? But there are distinctly human pleasures that rest on human abilities. Mill's stuff, he's a very fussy Victorian, so it's stuff like appreciating romantic poetry. But we don't need to make Mill's response as snobby as it looks. We can think, right? Higher pleasures, reading a book you like, finding out things about the world, listening to music. Doesn't have to be the sort of classical music Mill might like, even good pop songs, well done ones, jazz, all kinds of things that involve distinctly human abilities, right? Solving problems, fixing up a car, things like that. Learning how to cook a dish, those involve distinctly human abilities. Those are higher pleasures. And so this distinction, what it allows Mill to do, Mill could say, well, look, what's wrong with the life of the guy with the wire in his head? He has lots and lots of the lower pleasures. He has as much of those as you could ever want. His life is missing the higher pleasures. He's just passively laying in a bed. He doesn't have any of the pleasures that human beings can experience that are distinctive of us. That's why Mill would say the life of this guy with the wire in his brain is bad. He's missing the higher pleasures. Well, this is what makes Nozick's experience machine so very clever. So Nozick would say, imagine that the scientist is even better. He's come up with a machine that can simulate whatever life would make you happiest. So the scientist has come up with this machine. They can simulate whatever life would be the best for you. You might be thinking, oh, Nozick stole this from the Matrix. Actually, I think it goes the other way. The siblings who wrote The Matrix, at least one of them was a philosophy major, so I think they probably got this from Nozick. Nozick wrote this in the 70s. So the idea is, whatever life you think is good, or would make you the happiest, this experience machine will simulate. Now here's the thing. If you think the higher pleasures are important, we could build that into the experience machine. Whatever higher pleasures you want, whether it's listening to great music, cooking, heck, we could even make you think that you're a concert violinist, that you are one of these guys like Joshua Bell, playing a violin or piano or whatever to the highest degree possible in front of thousands of people. Or that you're a world-class scientist, or that you are a world-class chef, right? Whatever you want, you can get. If you want the higher pleasures, we just scan the brain of somebody who has them, and we can program them right into your brain. Would you think, The way Nozick sets this up, you wouldn't even know you're in a simulation. Would you say yes? Would you think a person in this simulation has a great life? They think they're a world-class chef or violinist or athlete. Actually, they're just laying in the bed. If you think there's anything wrong with their life, if you think their life is missing anything, then Nozick will say you can't be a utilitarian. Their life isn't missing pleasure, so it has to be missing something else. And Nozick will say, what this experience machine shows us, and the fact that not all of us would have ourselves hooked up to it, what it shows us is that experience isn't the only thing that matters. Pleasure and pain aren't the only thing that matters. What actually happens, not just what you experience, matters as well. Now, I make a big deal of this because this will be really, really important for virtue theory. Virtue theory will come back to something like Nozick's experience machine for it. Virtue theory will say, you utilitarians, you're right to define a good life in terms of happiness, but obviously more things than just pleasure and pain go into having a good life. So obviously we can't define happiness in terms of pleasure and the absence of pain. More has to be involved. Now, we can put that aside for the moment, but it will be very important when thinking about Aristotle later in the semester, so do keep it in mind. Okay, so I know that's went on for a bit, but let's just do what I promised at the beginning now and finish up utilitarianism. Let's talk about the advantages of utilitarianism very quickly, and then finish with the disadvantages. So I think there are three huge advantages to utilitarianism. One is it doesn't need controversial assumptions to get off the ground. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, imagine that someone tells you, well, I think you should do this thing and not do this other thing. That other thing would be wrong. And you ask him why. And he says, well, it's the will of God. Whether you're religious or not, that's going to be a very controversial assumption. You need to assume there is a God. You need to assume this guy's right about it. You might very well say, I don't buy what you're saying. Contrast that with the utilitarian. The utilitarian, you say, well, he says, you should do this. You say, well, why? And he says, well, because if you do it, it'll make a lot of people happy, or it'll avoid a lot of pain for a lot of people. And you say, well, why should that matter? And the utilitarian just say, well, look, you think your pain is bad. You think your pleasure is good. Other people's pain feels the same way to them. Other people's pleasure feels the same way to them. So you ought to admit their pleasure is good, their pain is a bad thing. That just is, you can see that from the nature of how pain and pleasure feels. That's pretty common sense. That's way less controversial than what this other theory might need to get off the ground. Pain bad, pleasure good, that's not a very controversial assumption. And as we saw earlier, when we talk about why is killing wrong, why is stealing wrong, the utilitarian can give us a very good account of many cases we're sure about. Why is killing wrong? Deprives the person that you kill of all sorts of good things, makes their friends and family unhappy. That seems a very natural way to account for the wrongness of killing. Same goes for stealing, right? Hurts the person you steal from, creates these ripples of unhappiness through society. Also does a good job of accounting for the exceptions, right? Sometimes it's okay to kill. Utilitarianism can tell us why. Sometimes stealing is okay. Again, utilitarianism can tell us why. Final advantage of utilitarianism, it promises a precise way of solving moral controversies. Utilitarians will say, look, when we get in a moral argument, imagine something about like how high our taxes should be, how much our society should help the poor, right? You have this argument and, one party might say, I don't know which side you're on, but imagine you're arguing with your uncle at Thanksgiving, right? One of you might say, well, people who are rich, a lot of them work for their money. Why should they owe people who are poor, especially if it's not their fault those people are poor? So the other person might say, well, but people who are poor, a lot of times it's not their fault. They're doing really badly. We could help them out, taking money that people might not miss. Why shouldn't we do that, right? If they're doing badly through no fault of their own, don't we have a duty to help them? Versus if people earn their money, shouldn't they be allowed to keep it, right? These are both pretty compelling reasons. In any moral debate, you're going to have compelling reasons on both sides, and it's going to be really hard to weigh those reasons. That's why we get in these debates that go on endlessly. Utilitarians think they could cut through all that, right? The utilitarian will say, look, we don't need to think about considerations on either side. We don't need to think about how to weigh them. We just need to ask what's going to create the most pleasure, what's going to create pain, right? And if you don't know that, the utilitarian will say, well, you can go out and do some good social science, do some economics, do some psychology, figure out what makes people happy and unhappy, figure out how to get that to them. If utilitarianism works, we could turn ethics into a branch of social science just as much as economics or psychology is. We could give precise answers to these problems. Now, when we get to the case studies, you might see, is there a worry, is utilitarianism going to be able to keep this promise? But there's something very attractive about this idea that you could maybe make morality into a science. Philosophers don't like this sometimes, I think, because we worry it'll put us out of business. But there's something attractive about it, and I think we should admit that. Final thing to say, though, the disadvantages of utilitarianism. And these are the points I've spent so much time on in these slides. First disadvantage, the utilitarian seems to ask for too much sacrifice and impartiality. Asks us to give up too much, doesn't allow us to take our relations with those near and dear to us as seriously as we should. Second, it isn't clear that pleasure and the absence of pain are really all we care about. That's the point of this experience machine. Well, if you think people shouldn't hook themselves up to it, or you wouldn't hook yourself up to it, you care about more than pleasure in the absence of pain. You seem like you might, as long as you go with that, you're not on the same page with the utilitarian. Finally, 3 and 4, utilitarianism does badly with respect for persons, more than consequences of actions that matter. Both of those are the kinds of issues that Le Guin's case raises. These things, fairness matters, respect for persons matter. Utilitarianism has problems with that. Not just consequences matter, doing your duty, being virtuous, even if that doesn't produce good consequences, that seems important. Utilitarianism cannot say that. Now look, none of this is to say utilitarianism is a bad theory. All of the theories are going to have advantages and disadvantages, but we should be clear what both are for the utilitarian theory.